what happened in 2023, some of the bigger things in your mind that's kind of stand out when you look back now?
I think the US regional banking crisis was a huge one. I think Silicon Valley Bank, the other two sort of digital banks or digital native banks that fell over, that led to the buy the dip program that the Federal Reserve released. I think that was a huge thing that was papered over that didn't really get enough credit or enough attention. And what that really exposed on a broader sense was, I'll choose my words carefully here because technically it's not because of an accounting sleight of hand, but realistically, the US banking sector was insolvent. And that was all caused by the fact that you had the US 10-year go from 0.25 to 5% in less than 18 months. So that was the biggest thing that we had to deal with this year. In a 12-month period, it went from effectively nothing up to 5%. What that meant was, though, from the US banking perspective, was that all of these banks that were holding the US 10 years at par value, what they bought it for, were probably 20% underwater, maybe still close to that. Maybe not so much now because the rates have sort of come down a little bit, but at some point in time, they were 20% underwater on a risk-free asset. And this is where, the biggest story, the dog that's not barking, is that, we had a banking sector that had huge solvency issues and they papered over it. They basically said, look over here, click, click, click over here. Don't look at the mess. Don't look at the mess. you know, Hypnosis. This is not a problem. This is not a problem. And sure enough, it wasn't a problem. Everyone just got on with it. And what should have been, a total re-rating of the US banking system, they pumped enough money in to solve that problem. And they basically made good on all the bonds that were underwater. And it highlights, probably in a broader and deeper sense, the problem with what we have with man-made systems, that, they chose winners and losers there. They chose an accounting treatment that you were able to use as a banking in the banking sector, that, you could basically leave that at par value despite the fact that you're 20% out of the money on this. And it's a risk-free asset that you can leverage out the wazoo. And then you compare that to Bitcoin, which is considered a risky asset that gets marked to market at its lowest point since you purchased it. It's a completely it's bipolar way of treating two different asset classes. And Bitcoin gets treated like the red-headed stepchild, and the US bonds get treated in kid gloves, and they can do no wrong. And even though when they're 20% underwater, the Federal Reserve will still make good on that and buy them at par value. So I mean, that I think is the biggest story of the year from a macro perspective. It got nowhere near enough, I think, attention. And probably one of the reasons why it got not enough attention was because, you put this into perspective, we had Credit Suisse effectively fall over and get folded into, another German bank this year. That was a GSIB bank, or globally systemic important bank, and that fell over. Yet the US banking sector basically got a free pass from the Federal Reserve, and they were able to, continue on keeping on with that free pass. So as bad as the US was, I actually think it's probably worse in Europe. It was probably worse in the emerging markets because, we were sort of in the start of the US dollar wrecking ball, where, because everyone's indebted in US dollars, and they've moved rates from 0% to 5%, everyone wants to get their dollars back and have a risk-free return of 5%, which I totally understand. And that I think is the biggest story of the year. And a lot feels like all we talk about is macro now. That I think is the biggest thing, because that has a re-rating, and that's a domino effect on every other asset class, because that's how you value every other asset, based on the US risk-free rate. That sets the risk-free rate for the world, and that is how you calculate every other value of every other asset. So therein lies the crux of the issue from a macro perspective this year.
Okay. And then, I mean, it struck me though at the time that, although I didn't quite understand, it was quite evident that they were not going to let the free market allow this bank to fail. And what would have been the right thing to do if we cared about free market principles, if we wanted to be a genuinely free market economy? Would we have just let the depositors take the whack, the Oprah Winfreys of the world, who didn't have FDIC insurance? Or do you think there's any case to be made, well, a lot of these people were systemically important people, and we really didn't want to deal with a lot of the blowback, because those people, I think, as I understand, FDIC insurance is only up to 250K.
Yeah.
And so a lot of these, whether it was the Silicon Valley companies or some of the sort of more well-connected celebrities, they would obviously have a lot more cash in there than that. So, I mean, is that a fair characterization in a sense? I mean, not necessarily that they protected the important celebrities, but that they literally just didn't allow it to fail and essentially just intervened.
It's probably just human nature, pain aversion.
Yeah.
Don't deal with pain if you don't have to. So, kick the can down the road. And that fundamentally is what it was. I think, the market behaved the way I expected the market to behave. You had the All In podcast guys. They were screaming from the rafters about, oh, this is a systemic failure and blah, blah, blah. They've got to step in. And sure enough, they stepped in. I'm like, funny that, and they got their money out first and, ring the alarm bells and causing all sorts of havoc. And would it have been better to let some of those banks fall? Probably yes, because they're small banks, and the fact that they're small it serves as a forcing function for the other banks to start behaving and realise that they're not going to get bailed out. But the fact that they bailed them out and made everyone good, everyone whole, basically encourages more risk taking from the bigger banks, because they know that, well, if these shitty little banks are going to get covered off and squared away and they're protected, well, what are we? We really can't lose here. So it actually encourages further risk taking. And I had a conversation with someone a couple of weeks ago now, maybe a month ago, and we were talking about Bitcoin becoming a global asset. And the question was posed, do you think that the risk of Bitcoin failing in the next couple of months after the ETF is bigger, or do you think it's going to be better for Bitcoin to have a couple of years runway as an ETF before we have a catastrophic failure with one of the banks? And they were on the side of having a few years runway before it becomes a catastrophic failure would be a better thing for the markets. And I pushed back on that and said, no, I don't believe that is the case. I actually think what you want to see is you want to see a catastrophic failure when Bitcoin is a $1 trillion asset. And you want to see these companies fail and fail very spectacularly in front of everyone to serve as a warning that this is an asset that you cannot fuck around with and that no one can bail you out from. And if you think about this, if it fails in the next 6 months, it's not going to be more than a $5 trillion asset, which in global terms is, basically sweet FA of the entire market of assets out there. It'd be less than 1%. And if you let it grow for the next 5 years or 10 years before it basically fails, what you're going to have then is it might be 25, 30, 50% of the total assets in the world. And then if it fails, that represents absolute anarchy in the system. And there's no way that any government can bail out that sort of catastrophic failure. So I want this to fail as quickly as possible, and then we can basically iterate faster from that, and it serves as a warning and a forcing function for the players in the space to make or to understand that this is something that is non-trivial and they can't muck around with it.
Yes. I mean, so I guess that's one big theme then, interventionism and some of the follies of it in terms of just kicking the can down the road and not actually resolving any of the inherent risks and weaknesses within the system.